All right, I think we are good to go. Clayton, if you want to go ahead and kick us off.
Yeah, no, good morning, and I'd like to welcome everybody for joining us. I'm Clayton Koopmann. I'm the vice chair of the California Rangeland Trust, and I think we've got a good lineup of speakers today, and hopefully teach you a little bit about conservation easements and how they might be a benefit to you and your family on your property or your ranches. Before we get going, I'd like to just share a little bit about my background and our story, my family. My family homesteaded in Dublin, California in the 1870s, and then moved over and bought a ranch in Sonoma, California in 1918, and have been there ever since, fortunately, with the help of the California Rangeland Trust. Uh, I'd be the fifth generation there, and I've got two little boys that are the sixth. But it wasn't easy to get to where we're at today. Um, as a child, growing up, my grandfather passed away when I was around 5 or 6 years old, and I watched my dad really struggle trying to save the ranch and keep things together. We got hit with a inheritance tax bill that was pushing $800,000, and at that time, that was, well, at this time it's still a lot of money, but at that time it was a lot of money, and we were struggling. My dad had considered selling the ranch that had been in the family for almost 100 years at the time, and it was something he didn't want to do, and it was kind of tearing him apart. And I know he wanted to keep things together for the next generation, and so he put together a couple ideas. I know we did some cell phone towers, and that helped. I think that probably covered the interest payments on the deal, but eventually he came up with the idea of doing some conservation easements, which we did through the California Rangeland Trust. And over the course of about 10 years, I think we completed three separate easements on the ranch, not the entirety of the ranch, but on portions of the ranch for habitat for the California tiger salamander and the Calipe silver spot butterfly. And through our partnership with the California Rangeland Trust and securing these easements, we were able to generate enough funding to pay off the inheritance tax, the debt that we owed, and we're able to hold on to the ranch in its entirety. So here we are, 2025, and a couple generations later, and still going strong. So, these easements can be a really powerful tool, can really help save a family operation or a ranch if you want to keep it going, and or a great tool or a great opportunity for people that for the right fit, and they may not be for everybody, but there's a lot of situations where if you're trying to keep the ranch together, or you want to see it preserved for future generations, say a family that member that was up there in years, and may not have any heirs and wants to see the ranch stay a ranch and not be developed. That's another opportunity to keep that landscape protected and in production. So with that, I think I'm going to kick it back to Robin. That's a little bit of my background. And again, thank you everybody for being here, and I hope you learn a lot about easements today.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Clayton. We appreciate it. Ian, go on ahead.
Morning, everybody. My name is Ian Howell. I'm with the Alameda County Resource Conservation District. Really glad to have you here. And Clayton, thanks so much for that introduction. That's hard to follow. Just a couple bits of housekeeping and some orientation on the program today. Let's see. So first thing, this webinar is the culmination of a series of workshops that the Alameda County RCD and the California Rangeland Trust put together. So we had two in-person workshops, and this webinar is really intended for folks who either missed those in-person workshops and folks who might have attended them but had additional questions. We're trying to be good listeners at those in-person workshops to refine the program for today. And I also wanted to note that funding for our program today comes from the Altamont Landfill Open Space Committee, and you're going to hear more about them from me and from other folks on the program in a little bit. First, let me just say a couple words about the Alameda County Resource Conservation District. We are a non-regulatory special district providing leadership in the county to enhance natural resources, preserve wildlife and habitat, improve rangeland and agricultural management through partnerships, education, technical assistance, and funding. You might have noticed none of that has to do with the Alameda RCD holding conservation easements. So why are we at the table today? We're not a land trust, but as Clayton pointed out, conservation easements can be a really powerful tool to protect a ranch and keep it in the family. In addition, they can be great tools for preserving natural resources and keeping working families on those lands, like Clayton was talking about. They can generate funding without having to sell or subdivide a property. And there may be other tax benefits. They've generally proven legally durable and they can be done voluntarily, right? Nobody's going to necessarily twist your arm to do this. So a little bit about today's program. In a minute here, Jackie Flatt from the Rangeland Trust is going to give us a primer on conservation easements, really specifically what the process is and how they work. She will be followed by David Wraa of Bender Rosenthal Incorporated, who will be providing some insights into land appraisals. We've had a lot of questions about the appraisal process in our previous in-person workshops. So we brought David in to help us out with that. After David, we'll hear from Dick Schneider, who is a member of the ACRCD Board of Directors, and he's going to be talking about the Altamont Landfill Open Space Committee, which can provide local funding for conservation easements in parts of Alameda County. And finally, we'll be hearing from Fraser Shilling, who's going to be talking about opportunities to provide some input into how that Altamont Landfill Open Space Committee values natural resources on land, and there's a good opportunity there for participation in future discussions around that. Last couple of things here. If you have questions, please do post them in the chat. I see a little bit of activity happening there, but I'm not able to read it while I'm talking at the same time. But that's the best way to get your question acknowledged and answered as we go. And before I turn this over to Jackie, I just wanted to read a quick quote, legal definition of what a conservation easement is. This is from a book called Saving the Ranch, which of course is all blurry. Sorry about that. A conservation easement is a legal interest in private land that perpetually limits development in order to protect significant agricultural, scenic, ecological, and historical resources. Conservation easements are voluntarily donated or sold by a landowner to a qualified conservation organization such as a land trust. I'm going to stop there and let Jackie Flatt pick it up.
Thanks, Ian. Hello, everybody. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Just a minute. All right. Trying to start it from the beginning. Here we go. Again, thank you everybody for joining us today. I am Jackie Flatt, the Conservation Director for California Rangeland Trust. I've been with Rangeland Trust for about 5 years. My background is in real property law. And after making the transition, I have seen many easements close, added about 100,000 acres to our portfolio, and have loved every minute of it. So I really appreciate your interest in easements and hope that I can provide some information that might be helpful to you in making a decision about whether or not an easement is something that you're interested in. So a little bit of background on Rangeland Trust. We are a Land Trust Alliance accredited land trust. Our mission is to serve California's land, people, and wildlife by conserving working landscapes. We primarily partner with ranching families to help permanently conserve their working rangelands. By partnering with them, we ensure that not only their ranching legacies can continue, but also their good stewardship of the land will benefit the wildlife and habitat in perpetuity. We were formed 27 years ago by the California Cattlemen's Association. There were many land trusts out there, and many ranchers were interested in easements, but it didn't seem like the existing conservation organizations might have been the best fit. Other organizations maybe had different priorities about what they wanted conserved or what kind of restrictions they wanted to place on the properties. And so the Cattlemen's decided to form CRT as an alternative to those land trusts and provide an opportunity for ranchers to know that there was somebody in the conservation space advocating for their interests. All of our directors on our board of directors are either ranchers themselves or directly involved in ranching operations. And that really gives our landowner partners a sense of trust in us, that we understand what their challenges are and that we're going to advocate for their interests when we are pursuing conservation easements on their behalf. So over the last 27 years, we have become the largest land trust in California by acres. Our last count was actually a little bit over 420,000 acres conserved across 98 ranches. I think we're going to hit that 100 ranch mark within a couple of months, so that's really exciting. So why you're here today, what is a conservation easement? So it is a voluntary legal agreement between a landowner and a land trust, conservation group, or a government agency regarding future uses of the property. And that will restrict future uses of the property. The landowner is going to retain many of the rights associated with the property, but there's going to be limits on what can be developed or subdivided or performed on the property. And our goal is to really make sure that you have all of the rights and opportunities that you need to be able to function and have as much leeway as possible within the easement to continue ranching and your operation as you see fit. So the easiest way to think of ownership of property is to think of a bundle of sticks. Each of the sticks represents a different right that can be given or sold. The rights that are given away or sold might include the right to construct homes, subdivide the land. As you can see, some of our sticks are labeled mineral rights, access rights, sometimes water rights, et cetera, et cetera. So by selling or giving away some of those rights to a qualified conservation organization, the landowner will permanently protect and restrict the use on the property. And I do want to note that it has to be given or sold to a qualified conservation organization, because that organization will hold those rights in trust in perpetuity. So it's important to note that the conservation easement does not change the ownership of the property. The current landowner will still be the landowner of the property once the easement is recorded on title. It follows title on the property forever, so the landowner may still sell, transfer the property, give it to their heirs. They are still going to be the legal owner of the property. Another important thing to note is that we do not have public access as a requirement of Rangeland Trust easements. Some other land trusts will have public access as a component. Some of our funding partners like to see that, but we don't pursue any opportunities that have public access as a component, because that's not necessarily aligned with a working rangeland to have public access. So there are a couple of different easement types. The first is a donated easement, where if somebody would like to just give those rights away, they are really dedicated to the philosophy of permanently conserving their property. They are able to do that. There are additional parts of language from IRS regulations that need to be included in that donated easement, because the landowner might qualify for some tax benefits based on their donation. That is obviously very specific to each landowner partner. And so again, we always recommend consulting with a legal or tax advisor before considering that. A purchase easement is whenever a land trust uses grant funds, typically from government partners from the state or at the federal level, sometimes from private funding partners as well, to make the purchase of those rights that the landowner is giving up. A bargain sale is a combination of a donated and a purchased easement. So if a landowner decides they only want a portion of the compensation that might be available, then they can donate the remaining portion and potentially have some tax benefits after that. A mitigation easement is the type of easement that Clayton was describing earlier. That is when a developer or even sometimes a state agency like Caltrans has to offset for impacts to specific habitat. So they look for landowners who might have the resources that they're impacting on the landowner's property, and then they're able to compensate them for placing an easement on their property to protect that specific resource. So this is everybody's first question, is how do you value the rights that you're giving away? And David will get into that a little bit more, but the very basics is that there is an appraisal that takes place, and it's really two appraisals. The appraiser will look at the value of the property before the conservation easement is placed on the property. They will not take into consideration the value of any homes or improvements on the property because those will not be affected by that conservation easement. It is strictly the land use and the rights of the land that you are giving up. So they will appraise the property before the conservation easement and then after the conservation easement is placed on the property. And that difference is the value of the rights that you're giving up and that you'll be compensated for in a purchase easement. So some people ask why landowners choose to pursue conservation easements. There's lots of different reasons. Sometimes it might make estate planning easier if you are not going to devise a property to several different heirs. It won't be split into several different ownerships with competing interests. A conservation easement will ensure that a property can never be subdivided. Sometimes the generation of funds through the selling of those rights is really important to reinvest in the operations or maybe in other income producing streams. When a donated easement is considered, it's usually for tax reasons to realize tax benefits. And then also, especially the biggest overriding factor is usually everybody's dedicated to preserving the legacy of their ranching heritage and the wildlife and the habitat on their property. So we aren't going to dive into the taxes today. Again, we can't give tax advice, but we do have a Conserving Your Legacy workshop series that does help cover a lot more of those questions. And we do have tax professionals and appraisers who present at those. So just giving a little pitch on that, our next workshop is in Ukiah on July 30th, and you can contact Robin if you have questions or if you'd like more details on that. So to pursue a Rangeland Trust easement, there are a couple of requirements that we do have. We always need to see that the easement will allow the landowner to continue ranching. We usually say that, rangeland and grazing purposes are an allowable use. That has to be in the easement. There are always requirements that there is good stewardship and care for the habitat. There will be limits on existing resources on the property, such as water diversion. Usually, water can be diverted to an adjacent property that's not under easement for agricultural purposes, but typically, everything has to be for the benefit of the easement area or agricultural purposes in general. We do have to perform an annual monitoring visit to come out, take a couple of pictures, talk to you about your operation, and just ensure that the landowner is indeed stewarding the land and maintaining it as expected by the easement. So if you're considering a conservation easement, there are a lot of things that we would encourage you to explore. Make sure that all of the stakeholders are on board, and that means everybody who is involved in ownership. If you are going to leave the property to your children, I would make sure to discuss it with them and ensure that you know what their plans might be, especially if they are planning on continuing the agricultural operations. If you've been considering changing or adjusting anything on the property, like a lot line adjustment, transferring from a trust to an LLC or vice versa, any other actions that might affect the property or the title, you should take those steps prior to us applying for grant funding. You don't have to do them before you actually apply to us for an easement, but we will talk you through things that need to be completed before we take steps to find funding for an easement. Consider your goals and maybe future generations' goals to provide flexibility. That includes what you want to do with existing residences, existing and future infrastructure, maybe commercial ventures like wedding opportunities or things like that. Those are all things that you need to consider before you take the next step. Also, consult your tax and legal professional to see what kind of tax implications or benefits that you might be able to realize. So I talked about looking for funding to make the purchase of those of those development rights. We do look to funding partners on the state and federal level, and I also mentioned sometimes local or private funding. These are just a couple of our funding partners. I don't have the Altamont Landfill Open Space Committee on this slide, but we should add it. And we don't have some of our private funding partners on this list too, but if you'd like more information about that, you can always contact CRT. So I don't have the ability to see the chat right now. And so we will look for some questions at the end of the presentations, but I think now is a good time to hand it over to David to talk more about appraisals and the valuation.
Perfect. Thank you, Jackie. And great introduction to the appraisal process, at least. And I will dive deeper into that. I have been an appraiser since 1989 when I graduated from UC Davis, and I really gravitated towards agricultural properties throughout my career. Over the last 4 years, we've seen a need for appraisers that understand how to appraise conservation easements, and that's been a whole new line of business for us over the last 5 to 6 years, with a lot of cattle ranches involved in that process. So for an appraisal, I'm going to give a couple of key points on what affects value and how we determine that. An appraisal is an opinion of value by an appraiser that has to be licensed by the state of California in this case. And we'll start with a market value definition. And really, there's different ones, but it's a most probable price. But there's a couple of key things in that definition of value is that the buyer and seller are typically motivated. No one had a special need to buy or sell the property. It has to be a typical market transaction. And then the other big part of it is each party is fully knowledgeable of the highest of the potential uses of the property, excuse me. And what they're referring to there is a concept called highest and best use. And highest and best use is the use that generates the highest value of the property. And there's some tests we look at. When we do that, we look at legally permissible uses by zoning, by general plan. Are there any private restrictions? And here in a bit, we'll get into the restrictions by the conservation easement that can certainly have a change in that highest and best use and a resulting change in value. We look at physical characteristics of the property, and then we go to the market. We really do emulate what market participants are doing. And my clients over the years have always asked me, how do you know if I have a good appraisal on the property? And what I do is I look at the highest and best use of the property and then what sales were used. Because the highest and best use dictates those sales. So if the highest and best use is wrong, the sales are wrong that are used to determine value, and the overall value is incorrect. For instance, if you have a property, a cattle ranch that has irrigated pasture, dry pasture, and rural residential uses, and that's the highest and best use. And you look at the sales, and they're all dry farm pasture with really limited utility and no potential of a home. That property is vastly undervalued because that highest and best use is wrong, and the resulting data is incorrect. So as Jackie mentioned, conservation easement appraisals, there's two. We have to appraise the market value of the property as it exists today. That's one highest and best use analysis. What is the potential of that property? And what is the highest and best use that would generate the highest value of the property as it exists today? The second valuation is the market value of the property subject to the conservation easement restrictions. And we have to go and look, what does that do to the highest and best use? It may restrict, there's a lot of diversity in ranches, and there may be a mix of dry pasture, irrigated pasture, possibly some cultivated land potential on part of the ranch. And the highest and best use before may be all three, with a potential for the 3 or 4 rural homes if the property's big enough. And after, the conservation easement may restrict, there's no ag intensification, so the cultivated land couldn't be farmed, and it may restrict it to 1 or 2 building envelopes that are negotiated. So that highest and best use would be somewhat different. It would certainly be irrigated and dry pasture, but any potential for a more intensive agricultural use in the value that was captured in the before value wouldn't be in the after value. And the sales capture that. So before, we use sales that match our highest and best use, but after, we go out and find conserved sales, properties that have sold with conservation easements, and they're all different, and we'll talk about that at the end, but they're negotiated, so we have to understand what actual rights are restricted in that conservation easement that the property that's sold subject to, in comparing that to the current conservation easement on the property. And that before and after, it results in a diminution in value to the property, which is by appraisal, and that's what that you would be paid through the funding partners for giving up those rights. And I'm going to see if Jackie will give me your bundle of rights exhibit. That was a great exhibit, much better than my sticks, but no, great concept. And there are those bundle of rights that a property has, and the valuation has to consider what those rights are, but also what those rights are worth. What's the value of those sticks now that are being given up? So before, you have a right to use the property how you want, subject obviously to your zoning and any potential existing restrictions that are there, right to occupy, use, exclude anyone from the property. And after, it's subject to a conservation easement. And part of that conservation easement is a loss of quiet enjoyment. We have had valuations where for example, there was a rice field and an oak habitat repairing area in between the 2 fields, and the conservation easement being acquired was for oak habitat. Well, that's what it is now, but the reality is that you are giving something up. You are giving up rights of loss of quiet enjoyment, that there's rights of access for different agencies to come on and monitor the habitat, et cetera. So that's part of it. There's also development rights. You can't subdivide, and I'm not talking necessarily about high intensity development, but if you have a minimum lot size, say, of 60 to 80 acres and a big enough ranch, you may want to possibly subdivide that out. Those rights could be given up in the easement, and it could have value. We look at the market for that. And then development of the home. You have existing homes and possibly expansion envelopes for future development, but we've also seen where the homes in some cases were restricted to maybe 2,500 square feet. And the ranch I was doing was in an area that they were picking up 40 to 80 acre properties and putting fairly large homes in those properties. So that size of the home restriction did have an impact on value and in the diminution in value. I did mention the right to farm. Again, it may preclude ag intensification or permanent plantings. Again, all that is captured in the value of the highest and best use and value before and after with the sales that are used. So that conservation easements, they are negotiated. The building envelopes I mentioned, a lot of times we do see 3 or 4 of them. Potentially, if there's existing homes, outbuildings, and hey, there's a building site here we'd like to retain. Again, the reservation of development rights is a big deal. But there's a ranch I wanted to spend a little time with, and it's very much like Clayton's story with what happened with this ranch. And the heirs, there were 3 heirs to this ranch, 5,000 acres, but an amazingly diverse property. At the bottomlands, we had irrigated and dry farm pasture that would transition into oak set of rolling hills, and then up to the top, probably 3,000 feet up, had pine forest. It was amazing. At one point, you could see the transition right into the forest land. It was a legacy ranch. The kids wanted to carry on the legacy of the ranch and have it not change. Um, Cattle ranch, and there were 3 homes on the property. Each heir had rights to use one of the homes. In fact, it was the site of the Pony Express Trail, and the Pony Express building was there. So there was a real desire and need to go ahead and conserve the property. So we went in to the rights that were proposed for the easement. We valued the property before and after, and they were hoping to get more out of the conservation easement, and it could be because of their specific situation in inheriting the property. And the question was, well, what other rights are you willing to give up? And here, it was such a special ranch, they wanted to bring the public onto the property. And that's a big one. Some of these, you could negotiate rights of the public on the property. That's a big impact to the property because there's some liability with that. But there was a irrigation canal that extended directly through the middle of the property, and they were routing a trail in cooperation with another land trust to bring the public on the property. That had a significant impact to the after value that went down. Conservation easement value went up, and they're currently working through the process. But we've seen a lot of Clayton's story, if you will, and Richard's ranch on these ranches throughout Northern California that we work on, and it's great business to be in and to see these amazing properties. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dick.
Thank you. Let me get my PowerPoint up and ready.
And while he's doing that, I'll just jump in and remind you all, if this is sparking any questions you have and you don't want to forget it, just drop them in the chat and we will address them at the end. Thank you.
All right. So I'm Dick Schneider, as Ian mentioned. I'm
Hold
on
on, Dick, we can't see your screen
You
yet.
cannot see the screen, huh?
No.
Can you see it now?
No.
You want to put up the version I sent you?
Sure.
So while Robin's getting that ready, I'm Dick Schneider. I'm a member of, as Ian said, member of the Alameda County Resource Conservation District Board. Prior to me joining the board, I was one of the Sierra Club representatives on the Altamont Landfill Open Space Committee for 20 years, from when it was first created until about 2021. And I'm going to talk about the Altamont Open Space Committee and the Altamont Open Space Fund. It's one of the areas where it's one of the places that money can be had for writing conservation easements or for acquisitions in fee title. So the Open Space Fund, you can all read that. Can everybody see it full screen well enough? I'll assume so. So the Open Space Fund is used to permanently protect land in eastern Alameda County, and it was created to mitigate the environmental impacts of landfills in East County. And there are two of them. There's the Waste Management Altamont Hills landfill, and then there's Republic Services Vasco Road landfill. So when Waste Management wanted to expand their landfill fourfold, they were getting a conditional use permit from Alameda County. Several entities sued the county and Waste Management because of the impacts that increase in landfill capacity were going to create. And those entities were Sierra Club, City of Livermore, City of Pleasanton, the Northern California Recyclers Association, and a local group to the landfills, the nickname Alarm. There was a settlement agreement. The landfill was allowed to expand, not quite to the size, to double in size, but not quadruple in size. But there was a mitigation fee, what they called a tipping fee, applied to every ton of waste that goes into the landfill, first to the Altamont landfill and then to the Vasco Road landfill. And that tipping fee goes in part into the Altamont Landfill Open Space Fund. There are other parts for mitigation as well, but the Open Space Fund gets half of the fees. And the Open Space Fund is used exclusively to provide acquisition in fee, money to buy land in fee title, or for permanent easements in eastern Alameda County. The first priority, and this is the requirements in the settlement agreement for use of the money, is to protect land with significant value for preservation of native biological diversity or wildlife habitat. And the second priority is to protect land having significant value for visual character or non-motorized recreation. And the whole fund is divided into two parts. The larger part is the 80% fund, which is on the eastern side of East County. It includes the city of Livermore. And 20% of the fund is used on the western side, which includes the city of Pleasanton. So please move the slide forward, Robin. This is a map of the Open Space Fund expenditure area. The black lines go around the East County Area Plan, which is the East Side General Plan. It includes the cities of Livermore, Pleasanton, and Dublin. And then the Open Space Fund actually goes a little bit into the Castro Valley side. So the entire area for the Open Space Fund goes from San Joaquin County line, Contra Costa County line, and Santa Clara County lines, and then along that orange line on the west side, which is the Fremont city limits, and then up through Palomares Road, up to Eden Canyon Road, all the way up to the Contra Costa County line. That's the entire funding area. The 20% area is the one outlined in orange on the west side. It includes the cities of Dublin and Pleasanton, and then goes all the way up on Pleasanton Ridge. The 80% area, including the city of Livermore, is quite a bit larger. Goes again surrounded by the county lines and the eastern city limits of Dublin and Pleasanton, and San Antonio Road and Calaveras Road. Next slide. So the Open Space Committee controls the Open Space Fund, and the committee has 4 voting members. Alameda County has a member. It's Supervisor David Halbert now, District 1. City of Livermore has a voting member. The City of Pleasanton has a voting member, and the Sierra Club has a voting member. But the decisions for acquisitions or conservation easements are made by 3 representatives, depending on which portion of the open space area the application is for. So for the eastern side, the 3 votes are the county's vote, the Livermore's vote, and the Sierra Club's vote. And on the western side, Pleasanton is substituted for Livermore, so that it gets a vote on land in its general area, its sphere of influence, if you will. Sometimes votes are made that are not for acquisitions or conservation easements to fund grant proposals, for example, and grant proposals for consultant fees, and those are required to be made by all 4 of the voting members. And it's a majority vote. It doesn't have to be unanimous, although in practice, almost every vote has been unanimous. Next slide. So how many grants have been made and how much money has been spent? The committee's been in existence for 25 years. It took a couple years for it to get started and figure out how it was going to operate. And over those 25 years, or 21 grants have been made for open space protection. 6 grants were on the western 20% side, and they totaled $3,750,000, and they acquired nearly 3,000 acres to expand Pleasanton Ridge Regional Park. And those were in the early part. It was East Bay Regional Park District was the main customer of the Open Space Fund. And then more recently, 15 grants have been made on the eastern 80% side, totaling $11,250,000, permanently protecting 1,794 acres. Part of the reason is that the land has gone up in value. Most of these acquisitions were in the last decade, not the first decade, and the price of rural land has gone up quite considerably. Only one of all these 21 grants, however, was made for a permanent conservation easement, and it was a mitigation easement. It was promoted by California Rangeland Trust. They applied to the Altamont Open Space Committee for a grant to protect land along Tesla Road, a ranch, to protect the critically endangered large flowered fiddleneck plant. I won't get into the biology of that plant. It's very interesting. But it was a great opportunity to show that the Altamont Open Space Fund could be used for conservation easements if there was enough interest to apply. And that's the reason for these workshops. This is the webinar, but the 2 previous workshops to interest rural landowners, rangeland owners, to consider conservation easements, knowing that there was a dedicated fund to make that happen. And that's the Altamont Open Space Fund. The Open Space Fund currently has about $20 million in it, in addition to the large amount of money that's already been spent. And funds are accruing at the rate of $20 million a year because waste is currently being dumped every day almost every day into the Altamont landfill and into the Vasco Road landfill.
2 million though, not 20 million.
Sorry, 12 million,
Yeah.
right. 2 million a year coming in, $20 million a year currently sits there. So how and when are decisions made? The Open Space Committee meets every other month, 6 times a year, on the 3rd Friday of odd numbered months. So January, March, May, July, and tomorrow is the 3rd Friday. And so the Open Space Committee will be meeting tomorrow, and it's actually going to be considering a grant to the California Rangeland Trust to fund a conservation easement on a ranch in the Altamont Hills. So the meetings are open to the public. If you are nearby, they're held in person in Dublin City Hall in the Bray Community Room, which is right next to the City Council chambers. The meetings start at 12:30. They can go to 2:30. They don't always go that long. And you're welcome to come. Lunch is served. They're also available to participate in online. And there's a Zoom link here and I think you can put it in the chat so that people can join the meeting as a Zoom participant and make comments at any of the items on the agenda, but certainly see how the committee processes an application for an open space conservation easement. And there are other grant proposals on the agenda as well. And then you can find out a lot more information about the Open Space Fund at the county's website and the Altamont Open Space web page. And there's a link here to get to there. You can get the the application. You can read this whole entire settlement agreement if you want, if you want to read a lot of legalese, but it explains exactly how decisions are made, not just for the open space fund, but for the other uses of the money. And that brochure is on there that has the map. So with that, I'll turn it over to Fraser Shilling, who will talk about another grant that's been made by the Open Space Fund.
Thanks, Dick. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about a project that that ALOSC funded, and besides having a banked amount of money they can use for conservation easements and for fee title purchases, they also slice off a bit of that $2 million a year to fund activities that support their ability to make decisions. So essentially, what kind of information do they need to make decisions about what the three people were previously talking about, conservation easements on ranch lands or other lands in eastern Alameda County. So I am with UC Davis. I direct a research center there and worked a lot with ALOSC, the Altamont Landfill Open Space Committee, and also Alameda County RCD. I think I've been part of Rangeland Trust activities way in the past, but not for a while. So I'm going to talk about something that's related to conservation easements and how to get additional income for ranch land conservation. But it's a little bit of a different angle. So I have a series of slides I'll go through, and they're a bit redundant because I think some of it is going to be new information for folks. All right, I have some collaborators on this project. They are listed on this title slide. I'm going to minimize. I have this, like all of us do in Zoom, you've got this whole stack of people on your little window to the side. I'm going to minimize that so I won't be able to see you. So if anybody needs to get my attention, please just audibilize and I'll turn to see what's going on. Okay. So the payment for ecosystem services, that's the root of what I'm going to talk about. It is a formal term. It has a formal definition. And at the base of it, it's providing financial incentive, monetary incentive to conserve land, to protect something about ecosystems. It could be clean water, groundwater recharge, wildlife habitat, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, wildlife habitat. And I'm going to talk about it to include plants and animals all together. So it's basically how we think about ecosystems on the surface of the land is a soil, plants, animal combination. So when those ecosystem attributes provide services that people value, for example, wildlife viewing or knowing the wildlife are there and so forth, then a payment for that ecosystem service is a dollar given to the holder of the land to keep that ecosystem attribute or process going. So in this case, to keep it simple, it would be money paid to keep wildlife habitat functioning or to make it better through a conservation easement or through fee title. So there's some important parts of this. So if we think about starting off with, we want to conserve land, we need an objective evaluation of these services. In this case, wildlife habitat is the service that's being provided. We need to calculate what the equivalent value is in terms of dollars. That allows us to make that payment. Then we have the payment in dollars to the landowner. You have a negotiation process that leads to that conservation. And I put this little diagram over to the side. And one way to think about this is that through a lot of programs, federal programs and others, you might have a calculation of a base value that land has for conserving soil, water, etc. And so we can think of that at the base. And payment for ecosystem services, you could think of that as an add-on when it's something like wildlife habitat. So if you are demonstrating that there's wildlife habitat value on the property, then there could be an additional payment for that service. So how does it work? So this is similar to the diagram, but now in words. There's an ecosystem attribute or a process like a functioning riparian area, and it does some work. So it's just by sitting there and functioning, it's doing some work. The work results in a service. And so in this case, it could be bird habitat or frog habitat in that riparian area. And that's something that society values. Society wants birds and frogs around, so society values that. And this service is a quantifiable benefit. So we can quantify it and we can give it a financial equivalent. These are all steps in this process for coming up with the payments. And the payments might be needed to secure that benefit. So if this is on public land, we might not need to do very much except maybe manage it to conserve that benefit. But if it's on private land, we might want to secure that benefit in other ways. For example, a conservation easement for habitat value. This very complicated diagram just shows how you could think about, up in the top right, the total economic value of a piece of land. Land is complicated. Ranching or other activities are complicated. There's a lot of things that can go into it, a lot of possible uses for land. But we can break these down a little bit and say, okay, so if we're thinking about this economic value, are we talking about a direct use of the land? And so, for example, on this far left, land might be used in a consumptive way to provide fish, food, fiber, fuel, etc. I think ranching is I would say it's semi-consumptive. Obviously, the animals are consuming plant material, which changes the land, but it's not quite in the same way as some of these others. Then there might be a non-consumptive use. And so this would be something like active recreation, wildlife viewing, and so forth. And each of these can be used to derive income. Then there might be an indirect use, which is the land's just sitting there and it's kind of accidentally providing this service, for example, groundwater recharge. So this green box and this purple box, these are places we can look at getting income from land conservation. So it's not the land being used very actively, it's the land providing a different kind of use for which we can calculate an economic value. And so how can we measure this? And I want to contrast two things here. The first is market goods. So this is something we're all used to. Goods in a market, they have prices. Um, I had a discussion with an economist about, well, what is a price? How do you even know how much something should cost? And it always comes down to what are people willing to pay for that thing. So market goods, we think of them as objectively priced, but they're always subjectively priced, and it's based on that market. You can easily determine what that market price is. It could include assessed value of land in an area for development purposes or some other need. Non-market goods are a little different. They're not necessarily bought and sold in the way we think of a market, land market, fuels, food market, things like that. So they don't have easily measured monetary values, but there are ways that we pay for these things. So we do have some sense of what's the value. Some of these are, what if people paid for these values in other places? We call those revealed preferences. So if, for example, there's a mitigation bank nearby that the Fish and Wildlife Service has set up for endangered species, and developers are paying into that a certain amount per acre, then you have an idea of what that market value might be for the non-market good, which is the endangered species habitat. You might also get what's called stated preference, which are things like people's willingness to pay. How much are people willing to pay to keep that thing going? It could be ranch land for its own sake. It could be wildlife habitat benefits on those ranch lands. So there's different methods we can use. And these values that we can get from people's willingness to pay, that they can state, I'm willing to pay this amount. That's often used for conservation fund, public conservation fund development, or that you have similar programs in a region, or you could estimate the cost of what would it take to replace this. If we lost it to development, how much would it cost to replace this? And a lot of these things are not easily replaced, so those values tend to be very high. So when you get down to some of the last great places in an area, the values of those places can get quite high, which is good if you own one of them. So how can we use this approach? And I took this is an aerial view of part of the Altamont Pass. I mean, I'm pretty sure I've been out to some of these places because I've seen a lot of windmills in the last few years. And this is just laying a hexagon diagram on top of it to show that you can calculate a lot of these benefits and services for wildlife habitat using something that's not showing a parcel. So this is not defining a parcel or anything like that. It's just saying we can calculate these benefits using something like these hexagons. You could use squares. So you can calculate what's the financial value underneath that square or hexagon. Then if you are wanting to support purchase of a conservation easement that's based in part on wildlife habitat, you could say, what's the value of the hexagons that are on that parcel? And that would allow you to calculate the dollar value for that conservation easement. So there's a really easy way to go back and forth between calculating these values and coming up with that, what the payment could be for that conservation easement. So to come back to that diagram at the beginning, the part that I'm talking about and I'll be working on over the next couple of years with ALOSC funding is to find this objective evaluation of the service that the wildlife habitat's providing and what the equivalent value would be in dollars to support this payment for ecosystem services, additional value for a property that has those services, that has that wildlife habitat. So the value of this approach to funders, for example, the ALOSC, is that it helps them to meet their requirements under their rules. And so they have a settlement agreement with rules that says this is how you have to spend the money. So it helps them to stick to that. It helps to provide a transparent financial rationale for why they make certain purchases. And even though the ALOSC it's a public entity with a public board and has public meetings, it has to provide some reason for why it's making certain purchases to maintain sort of a trusted standing. I don't think it has to take into account the opinions of the public, but it does take into account. So it helps with that communication. Also, decision support. Where should we prioritize easement or fee title acquisitions to support the wildlife habitat goals of the ALOSC? And finally, an accounting system. And that's to say, okay, so we're buying this land. We have, as Dick pointed out, this certain number of acres that have been purchased. But what is the ecosystem value we're getting for those purchases? So you have that combination of habitat value and dollar value that's been spent. The value to landowners could be, and this is, I'm speculating. I've been a landowner in the past. And I have a smaller parcel. I wouldn't call it anything like a big land, but predictability. If you have a piece of land and you're managing it for some of these benefits, you can get an idea, what's my return going to be? So it gives you some predictability for what the return might be on a conservation investment. Also for those involved in, if you're selling cattle and with a branding for conservation value, it helps with that communication of that value in case that's part of the marketing that's taking place. And obviously we see this a lot in Marin County, but in a lot of other places as well. Income, it's a way to show and provide stable per acre income for land. So you're not necessarily going up and down with a market that can fluctuate like a food-based market. And it could be a very stable income just based on the wildlife habitat value of the land. And then bequest value, what are you providing to society? And that's sort of that feel-good factor that accompanies a lot of these decisions. But I put the question marks in there because I want to hear from you guys. What kinds of value do you think you'd get out of understanding if I have this amount of wildlife habitat, I know that I have this amount of financial value, dollar value for lands that I own. I just wanted to show this is our project phasing. This project is going to start up in October. So this is sort of a prequel. The first part of it is to actually communicate with stakeholders and landowners and others and say, what are the kinds of priorities we should have? So basically framing the system we're developing. Then we'll develop a method for how to calculate these values. And it's all transparent. So we'll look for feedback on that from you all and ALOSC. And then we'll develop a final method. And this is the method for how we take wildlife habitat attributes in different places and give it a dollar value. Then we're going to implement this method in an existing tool that the ALOSC has already paid for and update that tool so that the ALOSC and others can look at it and see what those values are. And then release a final web tool that helps make those decisions. So I would like any of you who want to either ask questions now or contact me, help give feedback and framing for how we should develop this system to help spend some of that $20 million that ALOSC has banked over the last decade. And I thank you all for your attention. Welcome any questions you all have.
Thank you, Fraser. That was super interesting. Yes, the first thing I'll share is we will have an email going out next week that will have a recording of this webinar, and it will have the links and information shared, and a bit more about if any of you are interested in being one of those stakeholders in Fraser's study, to share your thoughts for that first phase and wherever it can go beyond that. So we will have more information in an email going out to you.
And I put an email address in the chat for anybody who wants it.
Perfect. One of the questions that was asked was, Dick, if you could explain exactly how to apply for the ALOSC funds if a landowner was interested.
There is an application on the county's website. I think the link to it's in the chat. You should certainly look at the application. Typically, at least in all cases so far, it hasn't been the landowner who's applied. Most of these have been acquisitions by Park District or City of Livermore or Land Trust, and they've been the ones who have applied. So, but as a landowner, you should look and see what the application requires and what the committee is going to be looking for in terms of the criteria that they're willing to pay for, and then partner up. Well, it's certainly possible for a landowner to directly apply. If the land's going to be sold, there's going to have to be a buyer. If there's going to be a conservation easement held, there's going to have to be a holder of the conservation easement. So ultimately the landowner is going to have to partner with some other entity. And so it's going to be best to think about that and reach out to those entities to show your interest, and then work together in making the application. Tomorrow, there's going to be a meeting of the Open Space Committee. There's going to be an application, and that will be a good opportunity to attend the meeting and listen and see what the application is. And if you don't have the ability to do it tomorrow, the application and supporting materials are online on the agenda of the Open Space Committee's meeting. And so you can read to see how it's done in almost real time.
Perfect. Thank you. And then I had a question for Jackie and David as you guys were explaining the process. When you talk about the two different appraisals that happen, in between those two, is that when the contract is really hammered out as far as what restrictions will be on that specific easement? And then that second appraisal happens, but maybe the easement isn't completely closed yet, but the contract is? Does that make sense?
Yes, I understand what you're asking, Robin. And the conservation easement deed or contract usually has to be finalized before either of those appraisals take place. And it all happens at the same time. It's just they're valuing it before and then after the easement. And so they need to know all of the rights that are being extinguished in order to do the research. And David, obviously correct me if I'm wrong in any way.
No, you're spot on, Jackie. And it's interesting how the appraisals evolve because they're negotiated. So oftentimes we have phased assignments where we go out and we value the property, and it may be a verbal opinion of value at that point to see if there's interest to continue. And then we do a very minimal report, we call it a restricted report, that's submitted for grant funding with evaluation. And then at the end, oftentimes we have to come back and there's the final docs that we revise the report once again, get the final docs in for review by either the state or federal agencies at that point. So we make sure it's in compliance once we know who's involved with the funding. So that's kind of what we've evolved into for the whole process for doing appraisals for this type of use.
Great, thank you. And that actually reminds me that something that was touched on, but I don't know if we really zoned in on it, is in this grant that we received along with the Alameda County RCD to do these workshops and webinars. $30,000 was also set aside to help with appraisals because they can be a big cost up front before you know how this easement is going to go. So Dick, do you want to explain that a little bit more too?
Well, thanks, Robin. I was going to mention that very much, very same thing. So the RCD holds the $30,000. It's a revolving fund, and it's meant to kickstart the appraisal process or the conservation easement process to see if it's going to make sense for the landowner to not have to pony up the money initially. And if the grant is ultimately made to fund the conservation easement, then that upfront money will be repaid to the revolving fund so that it will be available for another easement proposal. And we figured that $30,000 at $10,000 per easement would be able to have three easement projects going simultaneously. And at least get them moving. I know they can sometimes take a couple years to finalize, but when they do, then the money that was advanced initially will go back into the fund for future projects.
Great, thank you. And absolutely, if you guys want more information on that, you can reach out to the Alameda County RCD or to California Rangeland Trust, and we can give you more information on that. And then I also want to clarify that California Rangeland Trust is just one of the many great trusts within the state. You do not have to work with us on any of these projects, but we are happy to answer your questions and have a discussion, or you can obviously Google, reach out to other ones. That fund is not restricted to just working with us. Other than that, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat.
One of the questions was, can farmers, I think that means cultivated agriculture, row crops, get these easements? And I think the basic answer is no, because so much conversion of habitat value occurs when you're going to be converting the land to intensive agriculture, that probably not, at least in the first priority. In the second priority area, which is scenic value and recreation, then it's possible, I think, for some amount of value to be attributed to that. But I don't think it's going to be for the same pot of money that would be used for the habitat value.
Thank you for that clarification. That's really helpful. Is there any other last thoughts from any of the other presenters? All right. Well, again, there'll be a follow-up email coming out next week that will have a recording. It'll have the contact information for the presenters, and we just really appreciate you all taking the time today to join us. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.